Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 8th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. These seminars are jointly organized by the Department of Education in St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. My name is Maja Changseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at Oxford. I convene these seminars together with Alia Khalid, Lynn Schneider, and Liam Gueron. Before introducing our speaker, let me attend to a few administrative points. This webinar, as you might have seen already, is being recorded and will be posted online in due course. We only record the first half of the webinar, the presentation itself. We won't be recording the Q&A. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or to ask a question. If you want to ask a question, use the chat function and write out your question in detail there. At the end of the presentation, we hope to have at least 20 to 25 minutes. I will be selecting questions and you will be invited to ask yourself your question directly. When invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. We have 4 more seminars advertised. In the next few moments, I will share a link in the chat to the webpage where you can learn about the topics of the forthcoming seminars and where you can book your place. I will also share a link to the YouTube page where you can watch our past webinars. Now, the best part, our speaker. I am absolutely delighted to host Dr. Rabea Malik today. Rabea Malik is CEO and Fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives in Lahore in Pakistan. Rabea's substantive interests lie in the areas of sociology of education and political economy of state sector reform in low-income country contexts. Rabea has a PhD in education from the University of Cambridge and more than 10 years of experience of policy and academic research in Pakistan's context. Rabea has led research projects on various different topics, including marketization of primary and secondary education, public-private partnerships in education, school-based management, inclusive education, and effective teaching. She advises governmental departments and NGOs on education reform design and education evaluations. Rabea is also assistant professor at the School of Education, Lahore University of Management Sciences. She's currently on leave though. She has taught there international and comparative education modules and research methods in the MPhil Education Leadership and Management Program. Today at our seminar, Rabea will speak about social distance, teachers' beliefs and teaching practices in a context of social disadvantage. She will present evidence from India and Pakistan. Without further ado, I will now pass over to you, Rabea. The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Maja. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Let me very quickly share my screen so we can begin. So the title, as Maja has already spoken to you about, I'm going to be talking to all of you about empirical work that we've done in Pakistan and India's contexts around teachers' beliefs and teaching practices. Our focus was on disadvantage within classrooms and within schools. So essentially the framing for the research study that all of this work is coming from as well, but also policy questions that are important for Pakistan's case and especially are that classrooms are becoming increasingly more diverse in both these countries. And this is thanks to a lot of effort that has gone into bringing out of school children into classrooms. India has made more progress than Pakistan on this front. So a lot of children who were traditionally for very, very long periods of time from very disadvantaged backgrounds, not even able to make it to school, a lot of efforts and reforms and policies have focused on getting them into to school. The next challenge now is to understand what their learning experience is and how do we improve it. There is evidence coming from various surveys that are being conducted in low and middle income countries that marginalized children from marginalized backgrounds, whether that be from low income households, whether that be children with disabilities, certain ethnicities that are marginalized, are more likely to be at the bottom of the learning curve. If you were to imagine the learning distribution for a class or a school or a cohort of students, they're more likely to be in the left tail of this learning distribution, get left behind. So improving learning for the most marginalized and those struggling the most has equity imperatives, has inclusion imperatives, but it's also important, if we're interested in raising learning outcomes for all, we need to focus on children at the bottom of the learning curve, which means we need to understand how we can help them and how we can support them. Now, evidence from education research that is coming from, I think, multidisciplinary perspectives within education, be it sociology, be it economics, teaching and the quality of teaching is perhaps the most significant factor that can help achieve learning gains and that can help support students do better in school, regardless of the background that they're from. What that means for us in low-income country contexts is we need to know more about what teaching practices are like, particularly with regards to children from marginalized backgrounds. In addition to teaching practice, one of the factors that is becoming really important is teachers' own beliefs. So there's a lot of, in fact, just today, Shwetlana Sabharwal from the World Bank tweeted about a paper that they've published, which looks at a very large corpus of evidence that has gathered over decades that experience, qualification, and even content knowledge may be factors that explain some aspects of good teachers, but what matters more is what teachers do and what they think, so their practice and their beliefs. So it becomes important to generate, first of all, data on these two aspects for us to know a little bit more what's going on within classrooms, how are teachers thinking, how are they teaching, in order so we can think about how we want to improve, how we want to support teachers better, and also how we want to improve the experience of learning for the most marginalized children. The social distance aspect comes from the fact that teachers, both in India and Pakistan, have actually become more and more qualified over time. So the baseline requirements for you to become a government school teacher in particular have increased, while the population of students that they teach has become more and more diverse. So the social distance between those who are teaching and those who are being taught has increased. And that becomes another dimension that impacts teachers' beliefs about who they're teaching. So I'll cover some of that as well. Just to go over the guiding questions, and also this really lays out sort of how I've structured my presentation today. I want to talk about what we found out about teaching practices in government classrooms. I'll focus more on the Pakistan data for this, how they vary in relation to different groups of children within these classrooms, and what do we know about the interactions between children from marginalized groups and the teachers. What are teachers' beliefs about students from marginalized backgrounds? For this, I draw on a paper I wrote with Anuradha De, who's from India. So I try and draw both on the data from India as well as Pakistan. And what are the implications then for the learning of disadvantaged students? So all the work that I'll be presenting today, and the data and the evidence, is coming from a project that was ESRC funded, and a collaboration between the Real Center, Pauline Rose, Nidhi Singhal, with Faisal Bari, myself, my colleague Sahar Kamran, Fiza Raza, and with a group of wonderful colleagues in India, Anuradha De, in CORD, India. So essentially, this study was based the same study was undertaken in the state of Haryana in India, and the province of Punjab in Pakistan. We took 3 districts in both countries and covered about 50 schools. So this was a mixed method study, which involved a survey as well of teachers, students, but then we used qualitative classroom observations and a lot of interviews with teachers before and after they taught in 6 schools in each country, so about 12 schools. So the type of data that we collected on teaching practices was we used narrative-based observation rubrics. So in contrast to, say, Stallings, which is a very effective and important classroom observation tool, which has been adapted also for Pakistan's context and being operated at scale, as well as CLASS, which also gives you a Likert scale. Our interest, because our interest was really going down into the nuances of the interactions between teachers and students, as well as on focusing on certain students, and we wanted to know what we could learn. So while we're aware of the limitations of a narrative-based tool may not be operational at scale, we've generated quite a lot of, I think, important information also that can feed into tools that can be used at scale. And I'll be happy to talk about that more during questions if you want. And we supplemented these with questions on practice with the teachers during the interviews. For the students, we sent basically 2 observers into classrooms in these 12 schools. One that was focused entirely on 4 students that we had pre-selected. These were students either with disability that we knew to be low performers because we tested some light touch assessments, or from some other marker of marginalization. And we were able to observe the same students in multiple class sessions, which has proven to be a very important. I use some of those data to try and show how some marginalized children actually sometimes fall through the cracks. We also collected teachers' beliefs on attitudes through interviews as well as surveys. Just to give you a sense of who these teachers were in Pakistan. So because, as I mentioned, the recruitment criteria to bring in better qualified teachers has gone up, what you see, the more recent teachers who've been hired with experience, say less than 10 years, first of all, the teaching force has changed. There's quite a lot of young teachers in Pakistan in government schools now. And they all tend to have at least 14, if not 16 years of experience. You do still have some of the older cadre that have been teaching in government schools for more than 30 years. Those teachers tend to have lower educational qualifications. While they may have more experience, but they have lower educational qualifications. So you also get this very interesting mix of the old cadre and the young cadre. And if we were to dig in and delve in more deeply about beliefs, practices, ability to adapt, to disadvantage in new modes of teaching and pedagogy, this kind of variation becomes quite important to consider. But I wanted to share with your audience sort of what the pool of teachers looks like that we're going to be talking about. The other point that I wanted to show was when we say that classrooms have become more diverse, and there's actually students sitting in classrooms that come from very poor backgrounds. We have up to 82% of the children that we surveyed in the household survey in these communities were in schools. And a lot of them, many of these ones that were enrolled were actually in government schools. So just to make the case that government schools remain, at least in Pakistan today, with the very wide growth in low-fee private sector schools and very important contribution there, government schools remain the first port of call for many students who can't, or many households who can't afford to pay for education. So it becomes important when you're talking about contexts of disadvantage and when you're talking about teaching practice, a very, very important proportion of students and the context that you need to understand is still the government sector schools. So just to start beginning to present what are the practices that we see that government teachers are employing? What we find out from our observational data is that the predominant method still remains teacher-directed practice, with very little interaction with students. So quite a lot of it is lecturing, quite a lot of it is assigning tasks, and sort of sitting back and letting things happen. That said, there are numerous instances of individualized attention. So we also found that teachers are aware of the students that exist in their class that need some help, and they try as best they can. Now, these are quite large class sizes. So the minimum class size quite often for 3rd to 5th grade, for example, where we were focused, could be up to 40 students or up to 60 students for the very large classrooms. And you've got a single teacher that's sitting at the front, you see, so with no support, with no teaching support in class. So despite them having, despite them trying different strategies, a lot of it still remains standing at the front of this class and lecturing to the students. There are instances that we observe which come through our empirical work of group work. So it's students seated in small groups. But what was very interesting, and if you read the quote as well, a lot of teachers told us that they choose group work because they feel that students can teach other students better. So there's a sense of shifting some of the responsibility of dealing with the students that can't do so well to other students in class. And this may be an outcome, as I mentioned, of the fact that teachers may not have sufficient support that they need in order to work with the number of students that they have in their classrooms. But also there's quite an open belief that students can help other students, that peer group and peer work works very well. In another quote that follows, you'll be able to see that there may be instances while this strategy works, and it is observed quite often, there may be instances where some students, again, are falling through the cracks. Other strategies that teachers speak about, and we also observe, is adapting the pace of learning. So quite a lot of government school teachers speak about using either curriculums from a lower grade or giving fewer items. Now, in the context also of a post-COVID world, what was very good to see is when we go back to schools and expecting learning losses, is teachers already, even in a pre-COVID world, had some strategies at hand. And this is in an environment where in-service teaching is not focusing on in-service and pedagogy as much as it can. So there's quite a lot of need to equip teachers with the tool of working with many diverse classrooms, but officially there aren't many programs that are covering some of these strategies. But on-the-job learning seems to have led teachers to develop a lot of these strategies and also speak quite articulately and in a nuanced way about how they adopt some of these strategies to support different students. But there is variation, we observed. So these patterns of differences between how teachers deal with children with disabilities that are sitting in mainstream classrooms in government schools. And we use the Washington group set of questions to identify children with difficulty in mainstream classrooms. We find that there's differences in how teachers are dealing with different people. So seating arrangements emerges as one way. So while teachers try and bring children to the front of the class, those that they know may need some support, it doesn't always happen. Though girls tend to be seated, girls with disabilities tend to be seated at the front of the class. The other thing that begins to emerge even during interviews, even during initial interviews, is teachers are very happy that children with some difficulties are in mainstream classrooms, but they're also not very hopeful about how much they'll be able to learn. And they don't talk too much about, so they seem to be happy enough that if these kids are present in class, that's good enough. Whatever they pick up, that's fine. While this is a positive attitude, not a negative attitude as such, but you can immediately, say that a lot more can be done in terms of how they can support these children, and that their expectations of these children and how much they can learn will begin to impact what these children actually learn. Our observational data also highlights a disproportionate exclusion of children who were perceived as low performers. So these are students who don't do so well in class, and many interactions. So with these students, you observe much more negative interaction. So our classroom observation tool used the same kinds of categories as class in terms of positive and negative interactions, in terms of classroom environment, etc. And we were noting specifically if the teacher was scolding someone a bit too much, if there was any other instance of violence, or just simply completely ignoring some of the children. So the likelihood that the children who the teacher knows to be low performers are also the ones that are ignored a little bit more. Here, so apart from the general patterns that I've spoken to you about, now I'd like to share some of the excerpts from our observational data that are focused on specific students. And you'll be able to see at the bottom, this is the same student that you observe, or the same set of students that you observe in multiple classrooms. So in the first set of excerpts, this one and the next slide show you, is the students that are sitting at the back, and these tend to be students, low in confidence, sometimes not very sure of themselves, sort of hiding away in the classroom, tend to get ignored or have negative interactions with the teacher. So the teacher does not make an effort to address or even engage the 5 or 6 students at the back. As I said, given what we know about how chaotic some of these classrooms can be, the point is not to blame the teachers. The point is to understand that in contexts of disadvantage, where in government schools, there may be need for more support for the teacher, so these students don't fall through the cracks. So while she's explaining different nouns and different concepts, the students at the back, the same ones that were ignored in the first observation, over here we see again are not sort of engaged with. And here is a different excerpt about one boy in particular, so what this second set of excerpts, this one and the next one show, is that this one boy, the observer observed, tried to approach a teacher and show his work, was very, very tentative, was very, very scared almost, and in the end did not end up having his work checked. When he returned to his place, which was towards the back of the classroom, and this was a low attaining boy, the observer asked him to show him his notebook. And when he rifled through, and this must have been April or May, so half the year has gone by, the school year has gone by. And when our observer rifled through his notebook, he realized that none of the lessons from the beginning of the year that this boy had been working on had been checked in class. So again, someone who actually needs more support. Again, not commenting on the intent of the teacher, but simply to say there are children who are falling through the cracks. So this one was, and because of our observation and because the fact that we were going with a narrative-based approach for classroom observations, we were able to pick some of these things up. This second excerpt sort of shows you the confusion that some children experience while being in class. So this becomes relevant also. I'd like you to remember this also when we go to descriptions of teachers, description from teachers of students they consider good students, and what are the attributes that they think make up a good student. So their belief about who's able to learn and who's a good student. So you see here that this boy who's low attaining, whose work hasn't been checked for almost a year, is confused, is lost in classrooms, and nobody's taking notice of him while he's sitting there. So these are really sort of bringing to life, when we talk about the bottom of the learning distribution, when we talk about children who are getting left behind, this is really bringing to life sort of the experience they might be going through in class, and also bringing to life the kinds of teaching practices, but also the challenges that need to be overcome in these government classrooms so that support can be provided to some of these children. So what we find, if I was to zoom out again, if I zoomed in a little bit on individual students, if I was to zoom out again, children are seated at the front of the class, interacted more with the teacher, there was more student engagement, their work was checked more often. It's not always clear that these children who are seated at the front are those who actually needed more attention. So low attaining children were more likely to be overlooked, and there's a higher frequency of positive interaction with high attaining students. So there's some reinforcement of advantage. If you happen to be an intelligent person, if you happen to be an intelligent student who also gets his support at home to do his homework, etc., etc., you tend to also get more advantage and more attention during class. So what our work actually confirms on teachers' beliefs and some of the practices that I've spoken to you about so far, there's a very large body of work out there on South Asia that confirms these kinds of differential practice for students from different backgrounds. In India, caste is a major marker of disadvantage and differentiation, and there's lots of documentation of negative interactions between either school administrations or teachers and students, or of neglect. So I think apart from negative interactions, neglect is as important a challenge to overcome for some of these students, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds. That's now coming out as well, RISE, which is a large program on education reform, which is again attempting multidisciplinary sort of evidence generation on questions. A recent paper published on teachers' beliefs about marginalization in Vietnam notes the same thing. Teachers are products of society. The kinds of disadvantages or marginalization or sort of biases that we have as a larger society may actually be pouring into the microcosms that are classrooms and our schools. And for us to be very aware of this and counter them sort of with positive reinforcement is very important. So the question becomes, to what degree are these beliefs encountered in capacity building or teacher training programs explicitly, and how often are we asking our teachers to reflect and articulate the kind of support that they need. So some of the work that we've done, which combine these insights that Anuradha and I have done, that combine insights from existing literature in South Asia, we try and link or try and frame, and I've put the reference for this chapter at the end of this presentation as well. We try and outline what mechanisms link teachers' beliefs to student outcomes. And what we've read around this, which goes back, to the 60s and 70s, and both in the global north and the global south, tells us that there might be two mechanisms through why teachers' beliefs matter. Teachers' expectations from students regarding how much they can learn establish students' own expectations about how much they can learn. And there's empirical work on this from the global north, and we might need to do that. The same for the global south. If your expectation about what you're meant to achieve is low, you're going to put in less effort. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for a very long time. Your teachers don't expect much from you. You don't put in the effort. Everyone goes home. The other channel for that links teachers' beliefs with outcomes is the level of effort that teachers themselves invest in how much they support students or not. So as I was telling you, if the teachers believe that it's good enough for the children with disabilities to simply be in class, they don't need to do much more to help them with their students, they won't be spending that much time supporting their learning. And that in itself then becomes a vicious cycle that reduces the outcomes for the students. So just to give you some data, both from India and Pakistan. So we asked students, we asked teachers who they thought a good student was. And here's a list of some of the attributes that both teachers in Pakistan and India listed out for us. Good students are those who are naturally intelligent, have high IQs, are hardworking, are well-behaved, do their homework, have their classwork checked, display higher levels of confidence, are independent learners. Now, if I was to remind you about the experience that we observed, this boy who's a low attaining student attempting and failing to get the teacher's attention to check his work, even though he's trying, because he doesn't come off as someone who's confident, because he doesn't come off as someone who's been able to get his work checked, may not get counted as a good student. Maybe that's why also he gets ignored. Another aspect is regular attendance, particularly in context of India and Pakistan, is very highly associated with very stable homes, economically and socially stable homes. Children who are from homes that are unstable, either because of wage laborers, either because of the family experiencing any other shock and having to move, etc., won't necessarily be attending school on a regular basis. There are many, many reasons within the household environment, which are very valid reasons, which negatively impact a child's attendance, a child's engagement. These are factors that need to be understood and for the teachers in school to be incredibly sensitive towards, rather than sort of almost become markers for being bad students. Oh, this is an irregular student. This is not somebody who's interested in studying. While there may be very real structural inequality reasons for why a student isn't able to be present in school all the time. So just sort of to link that, the vast majority, the other dimensions of teachers' beliefs around disadvantage was what they believed about their parents. So teachers overwhelmingly believed that parents who weren't literate themselves could not support their children, were perhaps not even interested in supporting their children, and these were the children who are going to have the most difficulty in learning. This is at the same time that they don't necessarily know how to support these children, but just that if you come from a poor background, you're less likely to be able to learn. If you come from a different background, a marginalized background, you're less likely to be able to learn. And also if you're a child with disability. So really the big takeaways for us from this, if I was to bring it together, is that if we want to achieve goals for learning for all, we will require an explicit, sustained, and I would argue disproportionate focus on improving the learning experiences and outcomes for children at the bottom of the learning curve. We need to know who these children are, we need to make them more visible, and we need to find out more about how teachers are interacting with them. Teaching practice is perhaps the most strategic and significant place to resolve disadvantage, and improving this practice requires an engagement with teachers' beliefs about a number of factors: their beliefs about their own ability to teach, their beliefs about how students learn, and their beliefs also about what they can achieve together. I'll wrap up there and stop there, but these really are the three key takeaways from focusing on teachers' beliefs in a context of disability.